Yes. 2.5 inches. Wait a second. You might have took that the wrong way. We're getting 2.5 inches of lift on the Bronco. We got with our guys at Rough Country, and they sent us a 2.5 inch suspension lift. We've been enjoying going off-road here lately. This thing sits just a little bit too low. So I think all of those 2.5 inches are gonna do the magic trick. Come on, let's get to work. So what we got on the table for today is a Rough Country 2.5 inch suspension lift for our 2022 Bronco. This thing comes complete with A-arms, driver and passenger. We've got some bushings and spacers and strut spacers and a track bar bracket, and we got a whole ton of fun to put on this Bronco. And then to top it off, we've got with our guys at Broncbuster and got their buster brace. We want those tie rods to stay, you know, tie rod, not tie rods broken. We don't need a Bronco hug. So let's get to work putting this stuff on our Bronco. First, let's get it up in the air so we can take a look at everything. Alrighty, got the Bronco up in the air, 4 jack stands, tires are off, and we took the rock blocks off. Tell you what, seeing this thing without wheels and tires on it makes it seem ginormous. It just takes it into perspective. So, I think with this kit, maybe we'll start with the rear end. You always start with the rear end. Rear end's great. Okay, so the first step in the rear is to remove the bolt from the track bar. You're gonna need a 24mm socket. Put that guy on there. Hold the back side of the nut with a wrench, and this guy's gonna be tight. So leverage. Take your jack handle, put it on there, and just give a. It'll come loose. I'm pretty sure of it. Yep. Just like that. Work smarter, not harder. Lots of times we do that opposite.
A few moments later.
That's a long bolt.
Many days later.
Alright, so I'm going to get the jack under there before the bolt comes out because that rear end don't want to fall. So once you get your jack under the differential, you know, support your rear end. Take and wiggle that bolt right out. So after you get the track bar removed, that bolt there, we still got our jack supporting the rear end. Next step is to remove this strut bolt. It says that it's a 1 1/16 socket, but if you're like me and you don't have that, well, I believe this is a 26mm. Fits pretty damn good. This bolt's really tight. So what we did is we took the floor jack, put under here, jacked it up, and got it broke loose. And now, oh, we look like pure man. Just be able to turn this thing like you ought to be. So here again, nice long-winded bolt. Eventually that thing will come out of there. We don't need a wrench on this side because as this tab comes up, there's a stop right here, and it'll start to undo, hold that side for us. So once you've got that strut bolt out, the next step is to remove this 8mm ABS wiring harness. Just like that. Alrighty, so the next step is to remove your inner fender liner. So what there is there's these little plastic clips Phillips head fits in there, unthread it, and then you can take and just slowly wiggle this out because it'll pop right out. Looks like there's like 6 or 7 of them in here, and then there's also 2 little plastic nuts up here on this stud here and then this stud here. Just like that. So then our next step is going to be to remove these top 3 bolts or nuts off of the top of the strut. Right. Alrighty, so once you have your strut on your table or somewhere where you can work on it, you're going to have to remove this roll pin. So simply just grab onto it and work it out. Just use a pair of channel locks, get that out of there. Then the next thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to cut down these studs to be able to get our factory hardware underneath in between the new spacer for the lift. One thing you're going to want to make sure of is this lift perch or spacer, whatever you want to call it, is thinner in the front and thicker in the rear. So you want to make sure when the strut goes back in the vehicle that you have the rear side as the thick side of your lift. So we just need to cut those down to the threads, mount that on. That'll be our next step. Alrighty, now that you've cut the top of the stud off, go ahead and install the new perch. See how that gives us plenty of room to the bottom of that. So we'll lift it up and we'll take our stock hardware and get it started right on there and tighten them down. Again, make sure the thicker portion of the spacer is to the rear of the strut. Alrighty, once you get that all tightened down on all 3 points, in your hardware there are these bolts that'll then go on top of those new studs. I think this is ready to go back in the Bronco. Alrighty, once you get it re-hooked in, just get a little bit of tension on those nuts. Take your 15mm, start tightening them down. Alrighty, so after you get those 3 nuts tightened for the top of the strut, I mean, give them a good tug or 2 because that's what's holding your strut into the vehicle. So if you're confident those are good and tight, and we can throw the inner fender liner back up and in, get that out of our way. So once you've got your inner fender back in, you're going to want to locate this 10mm bolt that's holding in the brake line. We need to remove it so that way we can get a different bracket in here for the track bar. Loosen it, not tighten it. Just like that. So then the next one you're going to want to locate on the brake line is another 10mm. We're going to take that guy out and then also take the brake line out of this little plastic clip. I think there's going to be spacers going under these, so as the rear end moves down, it keeps pressure off these brake lines. Just like that. Alright, so the next thing you're going to want to do is locate these little brackets that are going to go in between where it originally mounted and then lift the brake line up and off. Use the original bolt to go back into the rear end, so that 10mm. And then in the hardware they send you a 1/2" bolt with a washer and then a nut, and that will go through the top side and mount the brake line there. We're going to do this exact same thing right here as well. So, and then same process on this side. Use your factory 10mm. Alrighty, so once you get your brake line risers reinstalled, then you're going to want to grab your track bar relocate bracket. And as what we're going to do is it's going to slide back down in where the track bar originally mounted. You're going to use the factory bolt to go through there. And then on this end here, we're going to have to drill a hole and mount through there to the axle with another bolt that they provide for us. Then from there, the track bar will come down and bolt back into this bracket right here. Alrighty, once you get that bolt in place, next thing you're going to want to do is get your track bar into the new location. Like that. Then they send a new bolt with the lock washer on it. So then the very last thing you're going to want to do is reinstall the lower strut bolt, and then from there we'll jump to the driver's side of the rear end. So now that you've got the passenger side done, jump to the driver's side on the rear end, take out the lower strut bolt, and then get the wheel well fender liner out, and then the 3 nuts on top of the strut. Here again, keep your jack underneath the rear end, so that way when that strut starts to come down, you can control how fast the rear end falls. So let's get that done. Alright, got the lower bolt out, and then now we can take off those top 3 nuts, just like the other side. That's a round 2. Alright, same as the other side. That roll pin, let's get that out of there. That's garbage. And then we'll take just the tops of those studs off. Alrighty then, grab your spacer. Again, the small side goes to the front, the big side to the back. There are these like little notches inside here. As long as you make sure those are at the back, then you'll be set. Alright, once it's on there, good and tight, should be 3 nuts, and you're good to go. Put it back in. So once you get all 3 of those nuts tightened up, go ahead and reinstall your fender liner, and then start tightening up the lower bolt on the bottom of the spring thingy that's a springy strut. And that is the complete lift portion for the rear end. Again, this is a 2.5-inch lift. Spacer goes in between the frame and the strut. So on the driver's side, all you have to do is undo it from the top and the bottom. And then on the passenger side, that's when we had to undo the brake lines, relocate those up a little bit, and then also change around the track bar to relocate it to keep it nice and straight in there. The rear portion was nice and easy. I think honestly the worst part was just having to drill that one hole to get that bolt in there for that track bar relocation bracket. Just standing here looking at the Bronco, you can definitely tell 2.5 inches is quite a big difference. Alrighty, so let's jump to the front now. First thing that we've got to do is remove the skid plate, if you have one. I'd imagine you do. We do. Do you have a skid plate? If you do you use your skid plate? We do. We're going to take it off now. Come on. The plates that you skid on, it says remove them. Well, this is going to be fine. All right. That's all of them. So now that you got your skid plates off, the next step is to remove your tie rod. So you're going to take a 21 millimeter, undo that bolt. And then they say, take a hammer, smack it right there, and your ball joint should pop off. Let's see if that works. Just like that. So now that you've got your tie rod disconnected, we need to locate this 10 millimeter bolt. That's going to allow some flex on our ABS line and our brake line here. So remove that. So once you got that bracket loose, your next step is to remove the upper ball joint with an 18 millimeter. And then same process here, hit the knuckle and your ball joint should pop up. So once you've got the upper ball joint broke loose, now the next step is to remove the sway bar link. This is a 21 millimeter nut. So now your next step is to remove the 2 lower strut bolts, an 18 millimeter. Now that you've got the lower nuts off the bottom of the strut, we need to remove the 3 upper ones just like we did in the rear. 15 millimeter. So next step is to remove the axle nut with a 36 millimeter socket. That's a big one. Just like that. Now you're supposed to leave your nut to where it's threaded on just flush with the axle shaft, and then take a hammer and hit that axle back, and hopefully it comes out easily. There's been a lot of people online say that this part is the worst part about doing this whole lift. Let's find out. All right, so I gave it one hit off camera and it popped right out. So it really wasn't that hard to get that portion to move. So now we can take that off of there. Then I've had this nut just holding the whole knuckle from swinging everywhere. So it was kind of tricky to get the axle to slide out of the knuckle, but once we got that, we're able just to take and push down pretty good on here, and then the strut just popped right out. So now we'll be able to just remove it and be able to work on it. First thing that we're going to do is we're going to remove the roll pin just like in the rear, and then also again we're just going to trim the top of the studs there so when the piece slides over it has plenty of room for the clearance of the factory nut. So we actually read the instructions and found out you only need to cut the inside stud. You don't have to cut all 3 on the front. By cutting that inside stud, because it's going to the lower side, it still gives you plenty of room on the 2 others to be able to get your nuts in there and have plenty of clearance room for tightening that down. Alright, just like that. Once you have all 3 of the factory nuts reinstalled on your spacer, that's all we've got to do with our coil. So, couldn't really get the camera in there and my hands at the same time to show you, but you're going to have to undo the rag joint off of the steering column to be able to get this A-arm bolt to be able to slide all the way out. That bolt goes the whole way through the A-arm. So it's just a 10 millimeter, loosen it up, and then you just kind of have to wiggle on it and it just pops right out. So next step is to loosen up that bolt that goes all the way through the A-arm. It's a 24 millimeter. So it'd be much better if you had 2 box end wrenches. I didn't have a box end wrench, only just a ratchet. So I ended up taking this 10 millimeter bolt off of here to gain a little more room so I could get my ratchet in there. So once you got that loose, go ahead and remove it. Just like so. Big old bolt. And take your factory control arm out of there. Get a new one. Alrighty, so we've made an observation because we're looking at things. So your factory control arm, when it comes in and sits over the pocket here, if I could do it one-handed. So when it comes over, if it's nice and snug, once that bolt goes through there, there's no wiggle on this factory arm. And it's because of how long these bushings are here. But on our new control arm, you can see how short they are right there. So when this comes in, sits in there, you've got a whole bunch of play from where that should be. So in the kit, they do send these spacers, and they look like they fit on there perfectly, and there would be one for each side. There's 4 of them, but in the instructions it doesn't mention anything about these, so I don't know if it's something that they changed or updated, or if this was a change from 21 to 22 on the Broncos. But I'm going to assume pretty safely that this belongs right there, one on each side. So as you slide that bolt through, we're going to put those right there. So once you've got your spacer and on top of your strut, take these off, and we'll get the strut mounted in before the new A-arm gets final installed. So definitely kind of a trick getting this reinstalled with that 2-inch spacer on top of there. Kind of had to, you know, do a dance and a jiggle and a shimmy and a shake, and well, we got it, but it was kind of a 4-handed job, so definitely have a good helper. Alrighty, so once you've got your strut reinstalled, make sure all 3 of the nuts up top are tight. Now we get to put in our new A-arm, and again, those spacers go in between the bolt and the shock tower, strut pocket, whatever you want to call it. Like I say, right now without those, just so much room that can't be right. So I think they've definitely corrected the problem. It just doesn't state it anywhere in the instructions. So let's find out. Once we got the drive shaft back into the hub, we tightened the nut on, and then we had to put the floor jack under to be able to get up to our ball joint and get this tightened. One key thing to remember is you got to pop this black cap off, and there's a grease zerk down in there, and you've got to grease this ball joint. They don't send them greased, so make sure you don't forget about that. Once we get this tightened, the next 2 things is we tighten up the bottom of the strut with the 2 nuts there, and then also the sway bar and link. Alrighty guys, so now that we've got our knuckle and our A-arm and basically the whole assembly back together, the last thing we've got to do is hook up our tie rod. Because we're doing a lift, it starts to put a lot of angle on these tie rods. So Broncos are notorious for breaking tie rods. So we wanted to try to prevent that. So we got with our guys down at Broncbuster, and we got their Buster brace. Basically is what it is it's a 2-piece machined billet chunk of aluminum, and is what it does is it just pinches the tie rod, and it supports this weak point where the threads go into the outer shaft of the tie rod, and then it just caps over and it bolts on with 8 Allen bolts that are provided with it. This is going to help prevent the issue of potentially having any breaking. So a couple things to note: you have to take your factory boot and slide it back to expose this little notch here. That's where that Buster brace is going to cover over right there as well. So the other thing to make a note of too is when you take out the bolts, you're going to have 4 short bolts and then 4 long bolts. You just want to make sure you get the long ones where they're supposed to go and short ones where they're supposed to go. It's a pretty clear distinction on the length difference. So not much, but enough that you want that to actually bite on. So let's install these on the driver's side, and then we'll jump over to the passenger side and keep lifting this Bronco. Alrighty, so it's just that simple to install the Buster brace. 4 long Allens and then 4 short Allens. One thing to also note is there's going to be a gap. The gap's for drainage, so as you're going through snow and water and all that good stuff, it'll allow it to drain through the tie rod and not hold any moisture in there. So don't crank on it until that gap's closed, because if you do, it's only aluminum, you'll take a chance of stripping that out. Then you'll be mad. We don't want you to be mad. Let's jump over to the passenger side. We'll do the same thing. Once you've seen this side, the other side's going to be exactly the same. Other than you're not going to have to play around with the steering column at all. So I think we'll probably time lapse the next side. So let's get at it. Alrighty guys, so that's exactly how you install the lift perch on top of your strut. One thing we tried was not disconnecting the drive shaft, and that didn't work out for us, or the drive line, axle, whatever you want to call it. Make sure you take that out. Once we got that popped out, that strut came in and out with no problems. So make it easier on yourself and follow the instructions. Makes sense. So now we're gonna get our Buster brace installed, get our tie rod hooked back up. Then we gotta crawl under this thing and move that differential down, because right now we've got a really steep drive shaft angle, whatever you want to call it, drive line thing, this spinny guy. So that whole diff has got to drop down. So once we get this on, we'll jump under there and get going on that. Okay, so now that we've got all the suspension lift installed, the next thing we need to do is there's a relocation bracket that's going to allow the front differential to drop down and give us less steep of a driveline angle. We'll show you that in just a second. But as what we're going to do is we're going to remove these 2 18mm bolts and then this one 21mm. You're going to want to support the differential with a jack. That way when this bracket comes down, the differential isn't going to want to fall. So let's get this bracket put in. So that driveline angle is just way too much. So when your suspension's at full hang or full droop, that will bind on that CV and eventually blow it out. So once we get this front diff relocated, hopefully that angle comes to a much more reasonable. Alrighty, so this is the factory mount. There's 2 bolts here holding it to the cross member. One going through it, and then of course one going through the actual differential itself. You can just see how level this piece is. And our new one goes on there, utilizes the same factory 2 bolts, and then also I believe it uses the factory bolt through the differential, and then the factory bolt here, but then we put a nut on it. And if you look at that, you can see how much of this drops down, and it's going to allow that differential to drop to give us a less driveline angle. So now that we've got that new relocation bracket in on the driver's side of the differential, now we're going to have to remove this bolt here, and it's going to get replaced with a new bolt that comes in the kit. But there's also 2 spacers that go on top in between the frame and the differential housing, and then also one that goes underneath here. So let's get this out and get that in place. There it is, guys. Rough country 2.5-inch lift on a 2022 Ford Bronco. Pretty easy installation. I would definitely recommend having a second set of hands. Is always good to, hold things and grab this tool and grab that tool. Just makes it funner to do jobs like this. But we'll post some pictures of the exact measurements of how much it came up. But from what we're seeing, it actually came up a little over 2.5 inches, like 2.8. It's about those points. I think it looks pretty good. But is this all that we need to lift it, or do we need to go more? Are these tires too small now, or are they just right? Let us know in the comment section below, but I think you definitely need to hit the subscribe button there's some stuff coming to this Bronco and adventures that you're going to want to see. So, follow along. For now, remember, get off the couch and go create your own adventure. We'll see you next time.
Bronco Adventures.